I would like to request the moderator and the participants to please take their seats on stage. Naeem Salik Sahab, Pervez Hoodbhoy Sahab, and Air Commodore Khalid Banuri. The moderator for the session is Ejaz Haider. He's a journalist since 1991. He has held several editorial positions such as news editor, The Friday Times, and executive editor, Daily Times. He has hosted TV talk shows on Dawn News, Sama, and Capital TV. He has written extensively for publications at home and abroad. He's a regular commentator on national and foreign TV channels. His areas of interest include defense and foreign policies, theories and concepts of war, international relations, literature, and satire. He's currently executive editor at Indus News. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you also to Oxford University Press, Pakistan. It's great to be here. And I'm happy there's sizable attendance for a session that people would normally consider to be dry. But I must say that the timing could not have been better, given the tensions in South Asia and also the fact that we're talking about a nuclear dyad, striking peace in a charged nuclear environment. I have an eminent panel. On my left is Brigadier Dr. Naeem Salik, who served for a very long time in the Pakistan Army, was also initially at the General Headquarters Analysis Wing, and then when the Strategic Plans Division was created, he was with the Strategic Plans Division. Then he was the second director, ACTA, which is Arms Control Disarmament Affairs. And post-retirement, he did his PhD, put out a book about nuclear learning, has currently recently edited a volume about India's nuclear learning. We just had a book launch about 5 or 6 days ago. Next to him is Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, needs no introduction, a very eminent physicist and also a public intellectual, someone who likes to put a bee in the bonnet, so to speak, which is great. And next to Dr. Hoodbhoy is Air Commodore Khalid Banuri, long career in Pakistan Air Force as a fighter pilot, and then with the Strategic Plans Division, retired as Director General, ACTA. A couple of things before I ask all the speakers to give their initial comments. The formulation striking peace in a charged nuclear environment seems to suggest that nuclear weapons and nuclear capability is perhaps the only variable which can or should ensure peace. I think that is a misconception, and this needs to be said at the very outset, because as far as if we are talking about peace, there are multiple variables, and nuclear weapons play a specific role in that. And therefore, to accord to them anything more than what the role that they're supposed to play is to essentially misguide the reader or the public or the viewer. So I think one of the things that I would ask Brigadier Dr. Naeem Salik to give us a sense of what exactly the role of nuclear weapons capability is, and we'll take it up from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ejaz. Let me add on to what you said earlier about nuclear weapons not the only variable for peace. I would also say that not in all conflict environments around the world nuclear weapons are a factor, because there are conflicts between non-nuclear weapon states as well. So there nuclear weapons do not play any direct role. Although we understand that because of the tremendous destruction power of the nuclear weapons, since their advent towards the end of the Second World War, all the wars and conflicts we have seen at the global level have been fought under the shadow of nuclear weapons. So they have had an impact in various ways, but they are not the only factors. Secondly, with the advent of nuclear weapons, the wars and conflicts did not end as some people believed at that time initially. calling it super weapon and all those kind of things. And it was found out that you cannot just wish away war and conflict. It will happen at certain levels. Whereas nuclear weapons provide you stability at the strategic level, the space for conflict at lower levels continues to be there. As we have seen that in the early days of the Cold War, the Americans who had demobilized their forces, which were raised during the Second World War, and thought that because of their monopoly over nuclear weapons at that time, they would be able to deter Soviet Union from any aggression in Europe or other areas of interest to the United States. Initially, the first doctrine they announced also was massive retaliation doctrine, in which the role of nuclear weapons was predominant and the convention forces had no real role to play. They were just to act as tripwire to inform about an impending attack, and then the nuclear weapons will take over. But then the Soviets, they also came up with their own nuclear weapons, and gradually people realized that even for the nuclear threat to be credible, there has to be a substantially strong conventional capability. This kind of feeling we had in Pakistan as well. I came across a lot of articles, letters to the army chief and others, people talking about the nuclear dividend, saying that now do we have nuclear weapons, we don't need conventional forces, we can drastically cut these down. And as we have realized in the past couple of decades, that you cannot just slash away conventional forces, because nuclear weapons have a specific role to play. They are not panacea for everything. For instance, internal security situations, counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism operations, you still need conventional forces. Then there is also misperception, particularly in our environment, where any infringement happening across the line of control is considered to be failure of nuclear deterrence. And even Indians have used the term that we have called Pakistan's nuclear bluff. Nuclear deterrence is not going to stop an individual or a small group of people just patrolling along the line of control, crossing over to Pakistani side, of few shells hurled across the line of control, or even some aircraft violating the airspace and hitting a target. That does not really constitute the breakdown of deterrence. If we realize that the smallest weapons we have fielded, the Nasr weapon system, even that is meant to deter an operation of the kind of cold start, which is actually, practically it means that it will constitute independent battle groups comprising mechanized and armored divisions of division size, penetrating the international border at several points. So that is the level of provocation which will invoke the use of, or contemplating the use of, nuclear weapons, or even of the shortest and the lowest yield. So I think there needs to be a lot of clarity on this. And as I said, nuclear weapons are not panacea for all the ills.
Thank you. I have to tell you something before we proceed further. I was initially thinking of making Dr. Hoodbhoy sit next to me. But then I thought, given the long sort of tradition of martial law in this country, I must squeeze him between a fighter pilot and a gunner. So anyway, so Dr. Hoodbhoy, I don't know if you've seen his recent article in Dawn, where he talks about nuclear strategists as conmen. And he's obviously not just talking about people in Pakistan, but also in India, in the US. It's very interesting that, Bernard Brodie, he famously said to his wife, after he read the news of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, that everything that I had written is now obsolete. And then, of course, they went on, the Yale group, and they came up with a book, and then he joined RAND, and there were people like Herman Kahn and others. At the end of the day, luckily, neither Kahn's theory nor Schelling's theories were actually tested. So let's say something about the idea of deterrence.
Well, let me follow up from what Brigadier Salik ended with. He said that we can't think of nuclear weapons as a panacea. It's not something that's going to give peace. But let's now step back 20 years ago when actually we thought exactly the opposite. We thought that nuclear weapons were the guarantor of peace and that nuclear weapons would give Pakistan now permanence in the region and would allow it to prevail over India. And do you remember Nawaz Sharif saying, अब हमें कोई मैली आंख से नहीं देख सकता, तो अब तो सभी मैली आंखों से हमें देख रहे हैं. Let me move away from general academics and what nuclear weapons have done in the post-war scene and come specifically to Kashmir. What nuclear weapons have actually achieved there is to freeze the status quo. Today, the line of control has become effectively, because of nuclear weapons, the international border. This is because India does not have the means by which to militarily compel Pakistan to vacate Azad Kashmir, and we, Pakistanis, do not have the means to evict India from what we call Indian-occupied Kashmir. This is something that was realized by General Musharraf. General Musharraf, after the 1999 Kargil operation, realized that although nuclear weapons had given us the protection from India in the sense that we could launch a covert operation in which we could get the Northern Light Infantry to go across the line of control and occupy the heights that looked over the road from Srinagar to Leh. Yet, beyond that, nuclear weapons don't do very much. So when the Indians started retaliating, of course, Pakistan had to back off. Then you had on the 4th of July, Nawaz Sharif flying to Washington and essentially surrendering. Now, this same General Musharraf, who had planned and executed the Kargil operation 4-5 years later, comes to realize that yes, nuclear weapons, our nuclear weapons have the ability to destroy India, but India has the ability to destroy us. And so why don't we get realistic about things, and why don't we think of a solution of Kashmir as being dependent upon softening the border, allowing divided families to go across, have trade, and soften things down. Now, nuclear weapons are again coming into prominence, the reason being India's annexation, Article 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution being overridden, abrogated by Modi, the forcible, the curfew, the horrors that now are happening in Kashmir, those have caused from our end threats of nuclear war. We, of course, are not directly threatening, but in every speech that Imran Khan makes, including the one that he gave at the General Assembly, he uses nuclear weapons as being something that will cause terrible damage and so forth. He's right about that. And he's right about saying that we don't want war. But on the other hand, the question is, can we afford peace? And when I say we, I mean, can the Pakistani establishment afford peace? It certainly can't afford war, but now the problem is that if we make any kind of sensible rapprochement on Kashmir, then, well, how do you justify such a large standing army? How is it that the army will be able to impose itself upon the people of Pakistan for decades after decades? That is the problem that the army and the establishment is now confronting.
Okay. There's something about of course, it seems deeply ironic that ultimately it wasn't a civilian but an army general who realized that the status quo has been frozen. So that says something about learning there. So I want to ask you, KB, about nuclear learning. But apart from that, is the issue of, once again, going back to what framework, what analytical framework one is using. Now, for instance, we know that the nuclear trend, weaponization in this part of the world, was not started by Pakistan, it was started by India. And we also know that states do not distrust each other because they are armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. So, you know, the direction of causality has to be very clear in this particular context. So, give us your initial thoughts and then we'll make it more interactive.
Thank you. Thank you also to Oxford University Press for asking me to join in at perhaps the 11th hour. But that's what I'm trained for in the Air Force, and the inherent flexibility. But before I respond to your question, Ejaz, I would want to register Pervez and I go back a long way, and I hold him in high esteem, but I respectfully disagree on, and we agree to disagree on several accounts that, you know, our positions are. Let's begin with that. There is this idealist school that looks at nuclear weapons. They are bad. If they exist, they will get used someday, and hence they shouldn't exist. There is reason and logic in that. But then there's a realist school, and I belong to that, which suggests that these weapons are here to stay, and it is the responsibility of states that hold them to be responsible with them, to use them with utmost care and protect them also because they don't go into the wrong hands, and so on and so forth. So what is Pakistan's position on that? And I've done arms control work for several years, so let me now switch to the kind of question that you raised. And arms control has several notions, theories, ideas, and one of the notions actually says adversaries can have common interests. And one common interest is not to have war, to avert war. That I would agree with, and I also look at this, that ideally nuclear weapons are meant in the concept of deterrence to reduce the possibility of war, to remove the possibility of war. But then there's also a notion of arms control that says in order to be believable, in order to ensure that peace sustains, you need to have adequate strength, I call that weapons, which are there, which exist, which are survivable, which are usable when push comes to shove, and hence can contribute to sustaining peace. So it's a complicated mix that tends to bring this out. Now, if you apply this to India and Pakistan, when India decided to go on the nuclear route and the weaponization route, for 24 years, and I say this all the time, for 24 years from 1974 till 1998, Pakistan tried in several ways to keep nuclear weapons out of this region. It even offered several of those ideas which are now overtaken by time, like simultaneous signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, like having a zero missile regime in South Asia, and so on and so forth. And when they saw that there's lukewarm interest or response from the international community, and there's also this idea of India will go ahead with whatever it does. So Pakistan did what any sovereign state needs to do to protect its sovereignty, and hence 1998, the second Indian wave of tests led to Pakistan restoring the strategic balance. So peace is, and I kind of come back to the comment that you made, Ejaz, about the title of this, Striking Peace in a Nuclear Charged Environment, is a kind of much more complicated than that.
Actually, it's good that you said that you were pulled in at the last minute, because I've been remiss on something which Dr. Moeed Yusuf said that I should tell the audience. He was supposed to be on the panel, but unbeknown to him, given the bureaucratic efficiency that we come across in Pakistan, without telling him, the government issued a notification in which he has been tapped for an official position. So that kind of created a strange kind of situation for him, and he had to pull out. But it's good that, because I think one other thing that I want to talk about is the model that Moeed, and Salik, this is for you, which Moeed presented in his book, which is about brokered bargaining, that throughout the Cold War, it was a two-actor model because there were two superpowers, two poles. There was no third or fourth parties strong enough to actually, sort of deter them or prevent them if something had happened. For instance, there was no party there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in this situation where you are going to have nuclear dyads, which are not superpowers, there'll always be third and fourth parties. And so the dyad is not just signaling to each other, but also to third parties. Would you like to say something about that?
Well, Ejaz, before addressing your question, I would like to make a brief comment on what Dr. Hoodbhoy said about Pakistan Army and establishment finding it difficult to justify maintenance of the large army. I wish he would have pointed out any other country, any other nuclear power which has given up its conventional forces, any country which has reduced the size of its conventional forces, starting from United States to Russia, to Britain, to France, to India. Anyone, if we can give an example that anyone just dismantled their conventional forces after going nuclear. So we have to accept the reality as it is. These are structural problems which cannot be just wished away by realistic and idealistic goals. As far as your point is concerned, obviously the difference is very clear between the Cold Start era, where the two superpowers were heading to blocks, and here are regional powers, essentially India and Pakistan, and who have more powerful countries above them in the international hierarchy with greater political influence. And since India and Pakistan are not totally independent, they are dependent even in the import of military technology from these advanced countries. So there are this client relationship, and they have to listen to those major powers in whatever they do. There has been a tendency on the part of the major powers that they were getting upset that after nuclearization, any conflict between India and Pakistan, if it is not controlled at the initial stages, it might get out of control and escalate into a nuclear exchange, which nobody wants. And secondly, these two regional powers also were going to brinkmanship, thinking that somebody is out there to intervene at the last moment before we just go over the brink. And that's exactly what happened, especially in case of 2001-2 crisis. And it happened to the extent that the direct communication between the two countries virtually broke down because of the frequent visits by the emissaries from Washington and London and other countries. The high commissioners were withdrawn by India and Pakistan, and even the direct lines of communication were not being used. The diplomatic channels were virtually abandoned. So you had actually outsourced your conflict to outside powers. And it has downsides also, because then you are not the one who is going to decide the outcome of the crisis, how it is going to end, and whether it is going to be favorable, the outcome is going to be favorable to you or not. But I think the situation is changing, and sooner or later India and Pakistan will have to realize that they have to act independently and responsibly, and to deal with their own crisis. They cannot always leave it to the outside powers because of certain very compelling reasons. The outside powers may not be as interested as they were at certain times, because in 2001-2 the Americans were very deeply involved in Afghanistan, so they had an interest in avoiding any conflict in South Asia right at their back. So they were very energetic. We have seen in the Pulwama crisis the American interest in that crisis, and whatever interference they made about it, it was rather lukewarm, and it was behind the scenes. It was not very public. It was not very open. In fact, they proved that they are not cannot be trusted as honest brokers, because if you look at the phone call made by John Bolton, it was virtually patting India on the back and encouraging them to take the kind of actions they took. So they were actually becoming a party. They were not acting as an honest broker. So we have to think about it, whether this model will be able to work in future conflicts and crisis situations as well.
Talking of responsibility, Dr. Hoodbhoy, you mentioned in your article also, and I agree with you, that once the spiral begins, no one can really predict, no one can really control it. As a matter of fact, since we keep talking about the escalation ladder, when Khan came up with his 44-rung ladder, he never said that it's predictive, and it could go up to the spasm war. So one of the things that which is problematic where everyone talks about the escalation ladder is to somehow presuppose that at some point, things could be brought under control. Now, given the fact, and again you mentioned that in your article, the erosion of India's no first use declaration. It was operationally, it has been eroded for a long time, but even at the declaratory stage, it is now eroded, given lots of statements. And given the kind of Hindutva ideology that has now taken hold of at least the Indian government, what prospects do you think of peace? And as a matter of fact, whether the weapons that are supposed to keep peace at that level would actually might end up destroying everything?
Ejaz, let me start with Herman Khan, the Cold War. 1962, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have, with 50% probability, actually resulted in a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union and led to the destruction of the world as we know it. There was a 50% chance of that, according to Robert McNamara, who was then the Secretary of Defense. If that Russian submarine's commander had actually, if one of his one of the people under him had not refused to carry out his order to launch a torpedo, a nuclear torpedo at an American aircraft carrier, we would not be sitting over here today. So strategists can make all kinds of imaginary scenarios. The fact is that probabilities are some things that do not lead to certainties in the outcome. Okay, now having said that, well, Pakistan, as Brigadier Salik has said, has gone through some nuclear crises. To be specific, there was 1987 brass tacks, there was May of 1990, there was the attack on the Indian Parliament in 1999, which blew up into a nuclear crisis. Then there was 2003, Operation Parakaram. All these had nuclear overtones to it. But let me come to Pulwama. Okay, now in those 4 nuclear crises that I've mentioned, there was a lot of nuclear rhetoric. There was no nuclear rhetoric this time, and so it would seem to support your argument that India and Pakistan have gone up on the learning curve and are becoming responsible nuclear citizens, so to speak. But now let me ask you, suppose the Indians had better aim, and suppose they had not missed that target in Balakot and had actually got it and killed 300 Pakistanis, would not our reaction have been much harsher? I think it would have been. Then we would have hit at the Indians much harder, and the Indians would have reacted to that, and this spiral would have gone up and up. Who would have intervened at that time? I don't know, because the Americans are not on our side. They did not condemn Narendra Modi's utterly irresponsible action of crossing the border and attacking Pakistan inside its territory. The Chinese, with whom we have pinned so many hopes, they didn't out and out condemn that. They were, well, they didn't approve it, but they didn't come out with a harsh condemnation the way we expected them to. Who will mediate this growing tension between India and Pakistan once some kind of a military action starts? I don't know. And so all this business of brokering peace in nuclear environments, I mean, it's all hokey stuff. Because you cannot predict what will actually happen. You see, back in those days, in the nice days of the Cold War and Herman Khan and Rand Corporation, you could make nice models because the Soviet Union and the United States did not have contiguous borders. Here we have borders and the passions run very high. You have politicians who are screaming for blood on both sides. And because they're throwing artillery shells at each other, sometimes those shells actually might go and hit something big. Therefore, I think that hoping for mediation is like wishing for the moon. You might get it, you might not get it. You might end up with a de-escalation of hostilities, or you might end up with a full-blown nuclear war.
Moeed, if he were here, he would have explained the model much better. But the issue with brokered bargaining is not that third parties, why would they come in, or whether they can do something about it. So you have to look at the trajectory. So his book discusses three cases, three crises, and on the basis of what happened, the diplomatic activity and the rest of it, how it panned out, to that extent, the model has been borne out up until now. What happens in any other crises is, of course, anybody's guess. But KB, quickly, and I want to open this to the floor also. Quickly, you see, the issue is that, I really want to live in the Garden of Eden. But there is this damn serpent that keeps sort of slithering around and then comes and, bites you. So in the real world, since we are not in the Garden of Eden, things happen. As Pervez said, that submarine, commander's subordinate, or for that matter, Tommy Thompson, the US ambassador to Moscow, who told JFK that he should go by the soft letter sent by Khrushchev and not the hard letter. So there were things happening. And since Pervez also mentioned Bob McNamara, I had the good opportunity of interacting with him through the pug wash, this thing, and I learned a lot from him and actually washed 13 days with him. So it was a sobering experience. So give us a sense quickly of the complexities involved and the role. Once again, I keep coming back to that because that point is still getting confused. The role of nuclear weapons. I mean, a pistol cannot act as a sniper rifle. You don't take a sniper rifle into a closed door shootout. So every weapon has its own role.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned Bob McNamara when he was in Lahore in January 2002. All four of us were there in that session, so interesting discussions there as well. I want to make 2 or 3 points on this discussion that has happened so far. I've had the honor to serve on Pakistan's delegations at the expert level on nuclear conference building with India in all the sessions that happened in Composite Dialogue, 2004 till it finally ceased in 2012. And here's my broad takeaway. There were some achievements in those CBMs, but largely the Indians would drag their feet and they would rather have this, we met, we had interesting discussions, we agreed to meet again. Those kind of ideas. Now the Western world tends to look at it, the Cold War model, and say, it was so hard to get the Soviets onto the table. You guys are actually talking to each other, so there's more possibility of achieving something. I am now clearly saying that there is CBM fatigue in Pakistan of do you want to actually do this or not. Now if you play this with what Moeed is saying about possibility of third party, you notice that Pakistan has indicated to agree to third party possibilities even now. India has not, but India has also nudged some third parties to do something about this. Yeah, they did. Precisely the point that there is this possibility of brokering. The question and the problem will always be, can you trust them? Can you have honest brokers? But now the world is changing in another way also. There are new realignments that are happening. And so there are possibilities of other states getting involved into these kind of brokerings. How it can evolve into something useful or not is yet to be seen. That's one. But I want to also mention this issue of what happened in Pulwama. One is, of course, the air operations are close to my heart, and I see the possibility of this. The Indian arrogance actually was that they thought Pakistan cannot handle operations, and they actually got that kind of a lesson. So there is a rethink on that. But you look at the notional approach that the BJP manifesto has, which talks about realizing the limitation, talks about enhancing the strike capability of the Indian military. So that's the broad answer to your question of, so what is the role of nuclear weapons in that? And the simple analogy that I want to give out here is that when we did not have nuclear weapons, or even during the time of existential deterrence, which meant no overt declaration or no nuclear explosion, even then, when they thought you don't have nuclear weapons, there were wars. When there was nuclear deterrence in play, whether before or after the explosions, there have been close calls, but that it has stopped short. So there is a specific role that one has to see. And I have several times, I've mentioned this in my public positions, that Pakistan's policy has always been on restraint and responsibility. And I want to add this third R into that. There is a restraint and responsibility, but there's also the resolve to protect the sovereignty. And that's the sense. And if you relate it with Pulwama, and Pervez very rightly said, a clear violation of Pakistan's airspace by attacking Balakot. Now, in the sense of air operations, yeah, and of course, but I'm actually saying Pakistani territory, Balakot, in that sense. Now, if you look at the UN Charter, and I teach use of force and international law as visiting faculty at Quaid-e-Azam University, Pervez's university, by the way. And I have actually looked at this subject that way. The UN Charter very clearly identifies the right of self-defense and as an inherent and inalienable right of self-defense. And there was a very clear reference to what John Bolton immediately said, talking about India's right. So the world is unequal, and at some point, states have to protect their sovereignty where the presence of such weapons will be relevant.
Just a sec. I also want to open it to the floor because I'm left with like 18 minutes. Yeah, okay.
Khalid, how do you see Kargil? Because Kargil was a war that would not have taken place but for the fact that we Pakistanis had nuclear weapons. General Musharraf would not have sent infiltrators across if we were unprotected by a nuclear shield.
Equally quick answer. Kargil was too soon for nuclear weapons to be operationalized. That's my short answer to this.
You wanted to say something quickly, but quickly before I...
First thing about Kargil, that Musharraf himself in his book has mentioned that the nuclear capability was not operational at that time. Secondly, the planners of Kargil had not absorbed the lessons of nuclearization. They were totally oblivious that nuclearization has taken place and situation has changed. Otherwise, they would probably would have thought otherwise. The quick point I wanted to make was about your mention of 1987 and 1990 crisis. I think they have been given the color of nuclear crisis, which I felt I just refused to agree with that. In 87, there was no nuclear capability. The whole story is built around A.Q. Khan's interview. And in 1990, they say that Sabza Yaqub Khan went to Delhi and gave that nuclear threat to I.K. Gujral. I had the opportunity to talk to Mr. Sahibzada Yaqub Khan himself, and he very categorically denied that there was any nuclear threat given to India, and he was even willing to go public on that. So I think we need to look at it in the right context. The nuclear capability was not there. If it was not operational in 99, how could it be operational in 87 and 90?
Great. So I'm going to open this to the floor. You need to identify yourself and short questions, starting with Ambassador Naqvi. You wanted to say something, sir?
Thank you, Ejaz. I am Ambassador Naqvi, Executive Director of Center for International Strategic Studies. I just want to add one thing and then ask a question. The point I want to add is that in 1990, I was myself present in the meeting of Robert Gates with President Ghulam Shah Khan. And actually there was no basis they had just seen some trucks moving around in Balochistan, and Robert Gates at the National Security Council rushed to Pakistan and arrived at 2 a.m. at night, and I was the one who received him. Anyway, 1990 was a false alarm, if at all there was an alarm. Secondly, the Pakistani case for trying to prevent nuclear weapons in the subcontinent is also strengthened by the other things that we did. We sponsored a resolution from 1975 to 1997 every year in the UN General Assembly for creating a nuclear weapon-free zone in South Asia, and also for negative security assurances for non-nuclear states. So these resolutions, we stopped acting on them after the nuclear tests that we had. Anyway, the question I want to ask quickly is about Pulwama and nuclear deterrence. There are two views about this, so I'd like the panelists to throw some light and also give their interpretation of the, because in Pulwama, when the Indians sent their planes to Balakot, some people hold that the nuclear deterrence didn't work.
I get your point, sir.
Thank you.
And I'll ask them to respond to this, but let me just get some more questions.
Thank you.
I'm going to ignore the seniors. I want the students. And yeah, and you can ask the questions in either Urdu or English, but identify yourself. Students and also female students. जी आप खड़े हो गए हैं हाँ जी
My question from all the panel, that somehow we have achieved the balance of power in terms of nuclear deterrence, but it also started some proxy wars, due to which other nations suffered. And we have, had more casualties than the, conventional battle. We are fighting war on terror, which is somehow, initiated or, supported by the other nations, other countries. How would you define it? Because it happened in past as well, when there was a Vietnam accident.
I get the question. ये एक तो आप सामने खड़े हो गए कैमरा लेके जी you
अस्सलाम वालेकुम
एक सेकंड आप प्रीएम्प्ट ना करें उनके बाद आप
My name is Aqib Manzoor and I am a civil servant. My question is directed to Professor Hoodbhoy, but I am sure
my name is Mushad Hussain. My question is from Pervez sir. Sir, nuclear weapons are very important for any nation. Nuclear weapons are very important for any nation because without nuclear weapons, many countries like European countries are very prosper and very and living a happy life. So please define, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir.
Everyone, I just want to ask that not with pomp, but there was a development made by both of these countries where they shared the list of locations of nuclear sites. One thing is that, how does it weigh in the peace narrative that we are trying to build and the peace efforts? And the other thing I want to ask is that the kind of leadership we are seeing in the world, demagogues, Bolsonaro, Modi, even Khan to some extent, and all these leaders, Trump, how does it feel that we are talking about peace and these kind of leaders who have some considerable influence foreign policy, and they are talking about open wars and some kind of confrontation? How do you see these kinds of efforts materializing? Thank you so much.
I would start by commenting on Mr. Naqvi's point about Pulwama and failure of deterrence. I think that's, as I mentioned earlier as well, that Pulwama was too small and too limited an incursion which would have invoked a nuclear response. As I said earlier also, the minimum level of nuclear response where it will just be, not that necessarily it will come, but it will be thought of, is the cold start type of operation. But I also believe that had we reacted to the September 2016 so-called surgical strike, probably Pulwama might not have happened. Some people say that nothing happened in September 2016. I say that we should have taken Indians for their word and responded to whatever they were claiming, and they wouldn't have dared to do anything in Pulwama. So that's the kind of the deterrence environment. Coming to the question which was raised of proxy wars and all these kind of conflicts, that is a dilemma which is posed by the advent of nuclear weapons, what we call the stability-instability paradox. That the more stability you have at the upper tiers of the strategic relationship between the two countries, there is bound to be a space for some kind of mischief at the lowest levels. And that's exactly what we have seen, because there is no space left for conventional operations. Indians have been trying to find that space below nuclear threshold, but you can only find it at very low levels, not even at the level of a limited conventional war. So that is something which comes with the nuclear weapons. So you get the nuclear weapons and you get into the situation of stability and stability paradox.
But there's one thing else. There's another way of looking at it also, which is that assuming that there were no nuclear weapons, would there still be no war on terror and the casualties because of war on terror? Because that's a completely different, framework and scenario altogether. Pervez?
वो साहब जिन्होंने प्रॉक्सी वॉर्स की बात की थी, भाई वो तो पहले होती थी, अब नहीं होगी. इमरान खान साहब ने कहा है कि वो पाकिस्तानी जो यहाँ से लाइन ऑफ कंट्रोल पार करके जिहाद के लिए जाते हैं वो पाकिस्तान के दुश्मन हैं. यानी कि जो हम पिछले 30 साल से करते आए हैं वो सारे का सारा गलत था और अब हम राह रास्त पे आ गए हैं. लिहाजा आप फिक्र ना कीजिए, हो गया मसला हल.
I want to respond to two notions that came up in these questions, but one about this last commentator who talked about कि दुनिया में जो wave बहुत ज़्यादा आ रही है ये this I've been talking about this ultra nationalism, चाहे वो मोदी हो, चाहे वो ट्रंप हो, चाहे शेख हसीना हो बांग्लादेश में, and several of this. Now this is a trend not only restricted to these countries, it is in the Western world, it is in Europe. Marianne Le Pen अगर फ्रांस में जीत गई तो वो भी उसी राइट विंग में चली जाएगी. ये सारे ट्रेंड्स हैं. The world has for several years moved towards globalization and cooperation. और इस तरह की जो अब nationalistic या ultra nationalistic positions हैं, they would tend to bring the relevance of traditional conflict back into the game. And if that be true, then there is a need to push back for the upholding of international law. That is what Imran Khan tried to do in the General Assembly yesterday. Now, I want to take this forward to Ambassador Naqvi's question, but deal with it another way. There's another lesson that comes out of Pulwama and before that from Uri. There's this, and since I teach the notions of international law in the context of use of force, there's international humanitarian law, जो Geneva Conventions के through implement करता है. That now has clarified, and Modi has unwittingly made this happen, जो कि पिछली even BJP governments ने भी बहुत अपने आप को carefully बचा के रखा था. That he's converted this into an international armed conflict, जो international humanitarian law के हिसाब से है. And that says that there are three situations जिसमें लोग अपने बचाव के लिए हथियार उठा सकते हैं. Against colonial occupation, जो अब पुरानी बात हो गई, against racial discrimination, जो also अब in a way दुनिया में नहीं रही, and against alien occupation. तो अगर आप ये देखें कि alien occupation के खिलाफ अगर कश्मीरी movement हो रही है, तो then there's a reason why these people are picking up arms, and that angle is in the purview of the international law. लेकिन जो चीज़ नहीं हो रही वो ये हम शायद नोटिस नहीं कर रहे, शायद कश्मीरी ये फ्रीडम मूवमेंट भी कोशिश इसकी नहीं कर रही कि जनीवा कन्वेंशंस के हिसाब से अगर इंटरनेशनल आर्म्ड कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है तो यूनिफॉर्म्ड सोल्जर इज़ अ लेजिटिमेट टारगेट. और आप ये देखिए कि इन लोगों ने चाहे वो उड़ी में किया या चाहे वो पुलवामा में किया, इन्होंने उन्हीं लोगों को अटैक किया जो उनकी मिलिट्री सर्विस, जो एलियन ऑक्यूपेशन के सेंस में थे. इस एंगल को अभी तक ज़्यादा क्लियरली सोचा नहीं गया. मेरे ख्याल में देयर इज अ नीड टू डू दैट. थैंक यू.
The important thing is that there are actions and there are reactions. Now, proxy wars were introduced, and I hope that you know that, were introduced in this region by India. And one of my personal problems with the general thinking in Pakistan is that somehow we believe that every other state belongs to the order of Sisters of Mercy and Pakistan is the only villain. That is not the case. Pakistan is also reacting to certain actions. And the rest of it, as KB has already mentioned, there are UNGA resolutions. They were primarily in relation to the Palestinian struggle and also in relation to colonial occupation, armed oppression. Not only can people under alien occupation raise arms, they can also call for external support. That is the legal UNGA position. Now, of course, there are issues and variables of realpolitik and machtpolitik. That's a completely different thing altogether. As for Prime Minister Khan's statement, the thing is that what even during the military rounds, what we won militarily, we lost linguistically. The taxonomy is very important. How we are assigning words and concepts to entities and things, that's very important. I think we keep losing on that count. But the student from there and then the civil servant from there. जी, पहले आप, फिर आप और फिर वो.
Sir, just small question from Dr. Hoodbhoy and Brigadier Saab, that what is link between extension of our Chief of Army Staff with the incidents? See the history from General Musharraf, Kiani Saab and Bajwa Saab. Thank you.
No, we are not taking this question. This has nothing to do with what we are doing here.
Sir, I'm a student citizen of this country, and I want to, first of all, I'm very honored to be able to communicate with the great leaders of our country. Now, my question is simple, and it isn't just my question. It is something that I heard Narendra Modi say in one of his election speeches back in India during his election campaigns. And this was in response to when someone asked him what he's doing to come up with peace talks with Pakistan. And he said, we don't know who is running this country. Is it the ISI? Is it the army? Is it the executives, prime minister, and the president of the country? So I mean, like, it was sounding very confusing. Who is running our country? And like, that was the reason that was the excuse he gave, that we can't come into negotiations with Pakistan.
I get your point. I get your point. जी आप जी वो उनको दे दीजिए.
Sir, my question is directed to Professor Hoodbhoy, but I'm sure the other panelists would like to chip in. Sir, I'm a fan of your work, and I've happened to read your book that you wrote along with other Indian nuclear scientists about the disaster that nuclear war could bring. You seem to believe that the mere possession of nuclear weapons is inherently bad. But given the fact that we cannot uninvent nuclear weapons, the knowledge to create these weapons exists out there. Even if Pakistan and India decide to give up nuclear weapons tomorrow, having the know-how to create nuclear weapons is, in my view, as good as having nuclear weapons. And since we cannot destroy the knowledge of how to create nuclear weapons, how do we find a way forward, sir? Thank you.
This was the last round. Respond and then we'll wrap up.
Let me first respond to this young man over there, and in the sense of who's. I think what you did is you said something which actually answers your question, which is this is the excuse that they use. The excuse will always be, and I'm now speaking to you with this background of experience of having negotiated or tried negotiating with the Indians on nuclear CBMs. The excuses will be used when you don't want to achieve anything. There's this main principle of confidence building that says get to the table when you actually want to achieve something. Agar nahi karna to mat jao. Don't try to give this semblance of your talking when you don't want to achieve anything. So that's the notion. So understand the spirit of it, and you answered it yourself. When you want to talk to a country, you talk to the government, whoever heads the government. Head of the government in Pakistan is the prime minister, whoever is that prime minister, and whatever is your assumption about it from another country. ठीक है, तो ये उसका जवाब है. I want to also, although your question is addressed to Dr. Hoodbhoy, who will respond to it, लेकिन मैंने भी थोड़ा सा कुछ जिक्र किया था कि ये idealist school और जो realist school का एक जो difference होता है. Now, based on this is the sense that you have that this notion of nuclear deterrence, and I want to quickly use this to use the analogy जो मेरे ख्याल में सबसे simple तरीका है to define deterrence. Don't hurt me because I can hurt you more from a position of strength. तो अगर ये सेंस है तो this justifies कि अब ये nuclear weapons आ गए हैं, and I exactly said this in my opening remarks. These weapons are here to stay. They cannot be wished away, and hence it's a responsibility to be responsible with them. Thank you.
देखिए, अगर मेरे पास कोई जादू की छड़ी होती ना, मैं इन सारे वेपन्स को ख़त्म कर देता, लेकिन है नहीं. और जैसा कि खालिद साहब ने कहा कि ये रहेंगे. चलिए, इस बात को मैं कबूल करता हूँ, मगर हमने कुछ सीखा भी है. सीखा ये है कि जब ये एटमी हथियार आपके पास आते हैं तो इससे आप कोई बड़ी अजीम कौम नहीं बन जाते हैं. वो ख्याल जो था जिस वक्त धमाके हुए थे 98 में, तो हर शख्स ये समझता था कि अब तो पाकिस्तान एक एटमी ताकत बन गया है, अब तो हम हम इस्लामी दुनिया की क़यादत करेंगे, अब तो पाकिस्तान नाकाबिल तस्खीर बन गया। तो ये सारी बातें गलत साबित हुई। इससे पाकिस्तान कोई अमीर नहीं बना, कोई मजबूत नहीं बना, कोई इसके पास टेक्नोलॉजी नहीं आई। दूसरे मुल्क भी इसको देखकर इबरत हासिल करते हैं। और ये भी देखिए, पाकिस्तान तो बहुत छोटी चीज़ है ना। सोवियत यूनियन जिसके पास 30,000 न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स थे, वो आखिर टूट फूट के ख़त्म हो गया। इसलिए नहीं कि किसी ने बाहर से हमला किया था, अंदरूनी तौर पर वो इतना कमज़ोर हो गया कि उसको फिर बिखरना पड़ा। ये बात है जो हमें सीखनी चाहिए। एटम बम तो रहेंगे, मगर ये ना समझें कि इससे आप कभी मजबूत हो सकते हैं।
I'm happy that Pervez ended on this tone because the wheel has come full circle. I started by saying that nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons capability needs to be put in a proper perspective. There are certain things that nuclear weapons can do, and there are lots of things nuclear weapons cannot do. And what Pervez is referring to back in '98, this was political bluster. This is awami bluster, so to speak. This is about saying, oh, humne ye kar liya, wo kar liya. People who were seriously involved in the process, not only of developing them, but also then strategizing about them, creating those command, control, and communications infrastructures and other organizational this thing. They were very clear about what these weapons are for, what they can achieve, and what they cannot achieve. Two of such people, practitioners, are sitting right here. Brigadier Salik, starting, as I said earlier, from the General Headquarters Analysis Wing, and then SPD, Khalid Banuri. So these are the people who know how this is. As far as Awam is concerned, तो वो तो आप कंटेनर पे चढ़ के कंटेनर के नीचे आप कुछ भी जो है ना फैसला कर सकते हैं। आपके पास 200 बिलियन रुपया जो है वो वापस भी आ सकता है और रियासत मदीना भी बन सकती है, एंड सो ऑन एंड सो फोर्थ। सो ऑल आई एम सेइंग इज दैट लेट्स differentiate between the real deployment and employment of a capability and public bluster. But let's give the panelists a big hand and wrap up this session.